What's going on, everybody? This game is from the World Cup 2011. Judit Polgar, who was 26.99 at the time, with the white pieces going against Sergey Karjakin with the black pieces, who at the time was near his peak rating at 27.88 and was on fire. This is the third round of the FIDE World Cup elimination tournament. Game started out e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5 from Judit. I just want to say real quick, Chess Audiobooks is on Lee Chess. Chess Audiobooks is on chess.com, Twitter, and Instagram. So please follow me on those platforms and support the channel by using the links below. Knight f6, castle. So we have Berlin. Knight takes e4, d4, knight c6. I'm sorry, knight d6. This is all well known. Bishop takes c6, d takes c6, d takes e5, knight f5, queen d8, king d8, and of course we go into our famous or infamous, depending on who you are, Berlin Wall endgame. Knight c3 from Judit, king e8, h3, h5, rook d1, bishop e7, and knight e4. And I'm just getting to the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of this game, because this is all well-known theory. Bishop d7, b3, h4, bishop g5 from Polgar, and rook d8. And basically all I want to say real quick about this endgame is that, of course, black has a 4-3 queenside majority, but the downside is that his pawns are crippled on the c-file, so they're really not that valuable, whereas white's 4-3 majority on the king side is valuable because his pawns are not doubled or isolated or anything for that matter. So white's basic strategy often is to, again, gradually simplify the game and eventually create a pass pawn on the king side that either white can promote to a queen or use that pass pawn as a sacrificial decoy to attack the weak pawns on the other side of the board. And of course this has to be done in a delicate fashion because there are many draws that result out of this Berlin Wall. Even if white ends up a pawn ahead, there are many drawn king and pawn endgames that result, many drawn rook, king, and pawn endgames that result. And this is why this has the reputation of being called the Berlin Wall, because it is very hard to overcome. Game continued. c4, b6, rook d2, and now bishop c8, and rook takes d8, and king d8. And as you might be able to observe, some of the difficulties that black faces is just the development of all of his pieces, especially the rook on the king side. Since he's lost his castling rights, it's hard for him to just bring the rook to, say, d8 or e8. So there's been many schemes employed. Sometimes the king will go to c8, then the rook will come over. Sometimes the king will end up on f7 after moves like f6. But black has to be careful with those type of ideas, because again, by playing a move like f6, e takes f6, and this helps white advance his plans on creating a pass pawn eventually. But those ideas, and sometimes the rook will enter the game via h6. Again, the timing is key. So king d8 was played here after rook d8. Another option is bishop takes d8, and I want to show you that because it is important, or it will be important at some point in the game. So bishop takes d8, bishop takes d8, king d8, and rook d1. Again, very equal looking position. And like for instance here, black could look forward to playing a move like king e7 now that more pieces have come off the board, and then eventually move like rook d8, trading the last pair of rooks. However, Karjakin opted for king d8 at the time. Rook d1 check, and now king e8 and bishop f4. And here is a critical point in the game. Karjakin plays the move c5. I want you to notice that this pawn on c7 is unprotected temporarily. So therefore, after c5, Polgar decides to sacrifice her e pawn in order to play bishop takes c7. And this is what happened. So bishop takes e6 from Karjakin. Bishop takes c7. And then Karjakin plays f6 with this idea of getting his rook into the game, and basically to protect the back rank. All right, because the bishop is threatening just simply to go to b8, but it's a bit too slow, and he doesn't have enough time to realize this plan because the pawns are exposed, of course. Another possibility instead of f6 is rook h6. And rook h6 is important because it guards this pawn right here. Of course, not right now because the bishop on e6 is blocking, but the bishop would be moved. It guards this pawn, and you'll see. So, for instance, in this variation, after rook h6, bishop f4, rook h5, knight c3, bishop d8, and let's say a4, a6, for example. And you can see that even if the bishop was to make it back here to b8 to attack the pawn that was on a7, black would have this bishop on d8 to protect that pawn. And that's the idea there behind rook h6. However, Karjakin played f6, and now after bishop b8, there's no adequate way to protect these weak pawns. So a6, then bishop a7. And remember what I told you about this bishop being on d8, protecting the pawn. Bishop d8, knight c3. And perhaps Karjakin overlooked this idea, which has the simple plan of knight a4, and then just winning one of the pawns, either the b6 pawn or the pawn on c5. King f7, knight a4. So now there's no way that Karjakin can protect the pawn on b6. So he sacrifices the c pawn. Knight takes c5, bishop c8, c takes b5, a takes b5, a4, and Polgar goes into a simple winning endgame here. Winning a pawn. Rook e8, rook b1. And the idea here, of course, is to trade off the bishops, the dark square bishops that is, and make room for the a pawn to advance. Now, the yellow boxes that I've highlighted are just there to point out how much power this knight on c5 has over this bishop. This is called domination right here. The knight on c5. Let me draw some more arrows. Matter of fact, knight on c5 is dominating this c8 bishop right here. g5 happened, bishop b6, bishop e7, and now a5. Bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, and now at this point, Karjakin is, betting on opposite colored bishops being useful to him, being useful to him in being able to draw the game. Rook b6, knight to g7. Bishop e3, knight f5, and rook b8. rook e8, and now rook a8, of course assisting the pawn. Bishop b7 now, rook a7, and not rook takes e8, again going to this opposite color bishop ending, which may be very drawish. Rook a7, threatening to win the piece. As you can see, the bishop is pinned. This forces the knight into the rook into passivity on e7. Bishop c5 with d7 and a6, forcing the situation here. Bishop c6, and now rook takes d7. Bishop takes d7. So now you had the opposite color bishops, but check out Judith's plan here. Knight d2. Right, knight d2 is going to guard the promotion square. All right, a7 is already guarded by the, I'm sorry, knight d2. The a7 square is already guarded by the bishop, and now white just has to control the a8 square. And this is the idea behind knight d2. C is to go to c4 and b6. King e6, knight c4, b6, knight b6. Now, why do I have this highlighted in yellow? Well, I want you to see this beautiful piece placement where the bishop on bishop on c5 and the knight on b6 are working together to create this wall, if you will, against the king. Notice the black king cannot pass through any of these squares that are highlighted in yellow. This is called piece coordination, my friends. Knight d6, and now bishop takes d6. a7, king c7, and a8 queen. Bishop takes, knight takes a8, and now king b7. Now some of you are saying, hey, wait a minute, isn't this a draw? Right, there's no escape for the knight. That's true, but Judith has seen further. And after the move f4, Karjakin resigned. The reason why Karjakin resigned is because there's no way the king can get back in time to stop the white advance of the pawn. So, for example, king b7, f4, that's played in the game. Let's say Karjakin grabs the knight, then just simply f takes g5, f takes g5, and then the white king just marches up and grabs the pawns. And that's going to be a win. Other variation is if black captures here, instead of taking the knight right away, same thing, king f2, king a8, because eventually you got to capture the knight, right? And just king f3, picking up the pawns, analogous to the other variation. And this is how Polgar was able to knock Sergey Karjakin out of the FIDE World Cup in the 3rd round in 2011. And now Polgar would have a great run in the tournament. She would go all the way to the 5th round, where she was finally defeated by the eventual winner, Peter Svidler. But this was a upset at the time, because Polgar, of course, was a strong player, but Sergey Karjakin was rated almost 90 points ahead of Polgar. And she was able to beat him in this Berlin exchange. Now I just want to go back and show some improvements where Sergey could have played better. So the first improvement, of course, instead of king d8, bishop d8 could have been played here. But that's not really the culprit. He still had some chances after that. So rook d1 check was played. We're going back to move 18, king e8, and bishop f4. Remember the idea that I talked about, that after c5, e6, right? So right away, instead of c5 here from Karjakin, again, rook h5 as discussed could have been played, and bishop b7, knight h2, a6, knight g4, And now c5, knight e2, bishop g5, keeping the pieces on, of course, bishop e7, f3, rook g5, and knight c3. All right, with a pretty equal game, although white is probably slightly better there. However, even after c5, that move was a little suspect because it allowed Judit to go with her plan, but it's still playable there. A little worse, but playable. So let's say after e6, the other alternative instead of what happened in the game, which was bishop takes e6, is f takes e6. So let's look at it. F takes e6, b takes c7. I'm sorry, bishop takes c7, bishop b7, and now you can see in this variation, since the light square bishop is not here on e6, instead it's on b7, it's attacking this knight which is hanging. Therefore, white doesn't have time to play bishop b8, of course, because bishop takes e4, and that changes the complexion of things. So knight fg5, for example, knight d4, and you can see again, game is pretty much equal, as black is not just dropping a bunch of a pawn on the queen side rather. And this is just a sample line, but you get the point. So instead of bishop takes e6 here, just simply f takes e6. And going a little further, even after bishop takes e6, black could do a little better instead of this move f6, as I explained to you earlier. f6. So the series of moves c5, bishop takes e6, and f6 for black is really what lost him the game. It wasn't really one of the moves in particular. It was more of the series of moves. So again, instead of f6, rook h6, keeping an eye on that pawn right there indirectly. Again, bishop f4 as showed before, and again keeping an eye on the dark square pawns. White again is a little better, but he's not just outright dropping the pawn as in the game. So after f6, bishop b8, then Judit was able, with this plan of moving the knight, just simply win the pawn and go on and win the game. So anyway, that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please get in the links, check the links below. Please consider supporting my channel via donation. Check the videos out, DVDs down there. Also leave a comment below if you like the video or if you have something to say about this game. But that concludes the story of Judit Polgar knocking out Sergey Karjakin in the FIDE World Cup. And again, we're going to be looking at some more videos from various tournaments. We're not always going to be looking at the most famous players, but some of the lesser known players, some players that you know, that might not have been champions and things like that. But we're just looking for good chess games that we can learn from, and that we can also share with the hardcore chess fans out there. So once again, please subscribe, like, hit all the buttons that you're supposed to hit to help move the channel forward in the Google algorithm. And I will see you guys on the next video.